for joining us tonight for the third and final program of our three-program series as part of the Humanities Montana's The Informed Citizen series. Tonight's program is titled Responsible Consumerism in a 24-Hour Media Cycle with Sean T. Johnson. And special thanks goes to Humanities Montana for funding this series. They have donation forms available at the back table over there, and if you could take one. There's also audience member participant surveys on the chairs to fill out, as well as a sign-up sheet to take attendance. So please fill those out at your leisure tonight. And finally, this presentation is being recorded by Missoula Community Access Television as part of a media assistance grant donated to the Missoula Public Library by MCAT. All right, thank you.
Thanks. Well, I'm going to start as I normally would, but we can make this a more dynamic conversation. So we can figure this out as we go.
I want to be able to read responses.
Great. Well, I'm excited because I will talk about this to whoever will listen, because it's a passion project of mine. But like you said, my name is Sean T. Johnson, and just a little bit about my background, especially if this is being recorded, so other people might know. I went to the University of Montana for a master's in environmental science and natural resource journalism, and kind of what sparked me to get there is this love of information and wanting to understand, digest it, and share it. And so kind of how I want to talk a little bit, frame today's presentation, a little bit of background about myself, but I really want to set up a foundation of why journalism is important and why it matters, because I think that gives us the patience to wade through this discussion of working through all of this information to find out what we really need, because it takes some patience. And without understanding why it's important, I think it's easy to lose sight of that and just jump to whatever your normal go-tos are. I want to talk a little bit about the evolution of fake news. That's come up a lot in recent rhetoric. And why is it coming up more now? How old is fake news? And how do we tackle that a little bit? And then really diving into some tools. So I really want to lay a foundation first, and then walk through some kind of academic tools, but they're ones that stick with me, that I remember without having to consult anything or remind myself. And then depending on time and interest, I want to talk a little bit about my experience as a journalist and some challenges of being a journalist. I think that lends some empathy sometimes when you understand the challenges of the field and why some of these errors might be occurring in what we're digesting. To give a little bit more information about why I'm talking to you about this specifically and why I care about this, so I moved to Montana in 2014 ready to become a journalist and to really dive into understanding dense information and making it accessible. Something that in my previous experience I had really honed in on was that there's a pretty big breakdown in communication, especially of technical information, especially of science. And Montana is one of the only places that offers a master's specifically for environmental science and natural resource journalism. And what that really helped me do is take complex information, distilling it for accuracy, which is something that we'll talk about today, and also making it relatable, which I think a lot of news today competes for your attention. There's so much information that we have to make it so relatable to you, and this big, maybe it's shocking, maybe it's outrageous, so that you'll pick it up, so that you'll actually pay attention because there's so much information. And so part of this degree is doing that responsibly. And something I never expected to happen was I found myself on the other side of the world in Vietnam. And how this happened was the very first day of journalism school, I walked in and they said, you need to start working on a project that's going to be newsworthy in 2 years. And everyone just said, how am I supposed to know what's newsworthy in 2 years? I mean, editors and journalists are fighting for news attention right now, trying to stay on top of it. And so something that they taught us was to look for anniversaries. And so immediately I found that when I would be graduating would be the 50th year anniversary of when the larger American public learned about Agent Orange use in the Vietnam War. And I thought, God, we've heard all about genetics and Agent Orange's impact on people, but I have not really heard anything about Agent Orange's impact on the environment. And like, did we just basically screw the forests of Southeast Asia? I have no idea. And so I went through the Mansfield Center, which is how Linda and I know each other. We worked together there. And went on this program and was like all set with my American lens of looking at this thing 50 years ago through our sole experience with this country up to this point, with this war, and what did we do? It was a very American-centric view. And I arrived there and essentially, like, yes, I followed up on this story, but it turned out to be a sidebar story. The forests, they're doing okay. There's some messy stuff that we're helping to clean up. We have a long-term investment, and there is a story there, but really being on the ground and being a responsible journalist meant seeing what's in front of me. What is the bigger story? And once I was there, it was pretty apparent that the people in Vietnam, they do not have this connection to the war that we do. Yes, it's part of the history, but it would be like us living in the Cold War. My generation being like, gosh, Russians, like Cold War. It's part of the past. It's not part of my current everyday future and existence and thoughts. What is part of that is climate change and the impact of sea level rise on agriculture, saltwater intrusion. There was just so much more going on that it really took me aback. And one thing, the reason I have this map up here and these colors, there's an organization called the Society to Protect Journalists. They go by CPJ. And something that they do every year is they measure basically the freedom of information, the freedom of access to information around the world. And they color code it from transparent to pretty controlled and censored. And in case you don't know where Vietnam is, it's this little S-shaped country below China, and it's only one shade lighter than China. It's one of the most censored countries in the world. And so me going there, I couldn't actually openly go as a journalist, and that was my saving grace being a student, was I was able to go as a tourist, a student doing research, and I did make sure that everybody I talked to knew that I was going to be somehow presenting this, like the information I gleaned in the larger American public. But it's partially why I'm so anchored in this subject tonight, which is responsible news consumerism. Because being in Vietnam and working with people who have very prescriptive access to information, for example, the Vietnamese government in 2007 recognized climate change as a national security threat. Everybody in Vietnam has heard about climate change. They know it affects their life. But that's that top level of information. There's no medium level of information to tell them why are their crops not doing well? Why is the water running out? Why is it saltier and harder to plant rice? So they're seeing all of these low-level things in their everyday existence. They're hearing about climate change, but they have no access to this information in between. And for me, it really opened up why is it so important that I can research whatever I want to here. And so part of the reason that I set up this foundation of who I am and why I care is because I think it's really important to talk about why it's important. Why is journalism and information important? And so this is where, being a two-audience presentation, you can tell me and participate. But, I mean, you're here for a reason tonight, partially because you have to be, but because you want to be. And I'm just curious, three-part audience, yes. Why do you care? That's like a real, yeah, why do you care? Why are you here tonight?
Because there is so much information out there. And I can grab the sound bites, but I know that there is so much more beneath that makes it true or makes it false. And I want to be able to understand, to the best of my ability, how to find out about these issues so that I'm on an even playing field. I tend towards liberal, I have to say, but I just want to know what it is, and how to work with it or take action for it.
Do you want to weigh in, Brian? I mean, you have to be here.
I think that truth is important. Like that there are like truths in the world, that not everything is shades of gray, and that there are some things that are just black and white, true or untrue, and that journalism is one of the best tools we have towards finding those truths.
Do you want to weigh in?
Well, journalism is, like you said, a group of dedicated professionals that are trying to take a whole bunch of data and make it more accessible for people who don't necessarily have the time to be able to go through it as deeply as you. And so that it's incredibly important, because 99% of people don't have the time to go and look into every single study that's happened, for example. Did they actually do the right, what was their methodology, and et cetera. They can't read the whole paper necessarily, or in some instances didn't even understand the paper, or the, is this fake news or whatever? Not fake news, but is this study actually one that could be reproduced? Yeah. Things like that. Also, a lot of people, like you said, you went to Vietnam and and when you were there, your story changed. I'm not going to be able to go to every single country and find out what's exactly happening, and journalism gives me an eye that I normally wouldn't have had. So it's incredibly important. That's why it matters, and it especially matters that people are doing their jobs to the best of their ability. I know you can't be completely objective, but hopefully the biases that are naturally there, one of the reasons why I like this series is that it helps me be able to see the bias of the journalists as well as my bias, and hopefully I'm learning so that I can get past my bias and see what mistakes I've made in getting looking for better journalism to consume.
I think all of you hit on everything that I also value in journalism. I, as a journalist, wanted to get closer to the information to help myself better understand what it is, but like you said, there's so much out there that this is why journalists matter. This is why finding good journalists and supporting journalism that takes the extra step to verify, to fact check, is so important. And I mean, very simply to me, journalism is this access to knowledge, and it's a privilege, and it's a responsibility. It's a responsibility on the part of the journalist to be the communicator, to be someone who works their hardest to ethically and fairly, I'm not going to say balanced because fair and balanced are very different, but to fairly cover what they're seeing, what they're experiencing, and to try to recognize our own bias as journalists, and then to recognize our bias as consumers. And so much of it, I mean, obviously you're here for the right reasons, and we don't have to spend that much time on the foundation of journalism, but I really think it's important to understand, because in this world of so much information, it's easy to get frustrated. And if we can go back to this core idea that it's a privilege, especially coming from countries that don't have access to this information, and I mean, Linda has worked with international students from all over and professionals from all over, and sometimes people come and you could just hear them talking to each other. I remember this amazing moment where I had a van full of people from China and India and Brazil and Russia, and just listening to them talk about, the person from India was just grilling this person from China, saying, can you ask this? Can you look at this? Like, it was just so interesting to see them come together in a space where there was no fear to discuss information. And that reminds me it's my privilege and my responsibility rather than my obligation or something that will always be there for me. And so I want to talk a little bit about fake news. Fake news is as old as news itself. It's nothing new, right? And there's some really obvious fake news, like when we're in the grocery store checkout line, there's this very famous publication called The Inquirer, and I mean, if you look, it goes all the way back. I'm back from the dead. I think this is from the 50s, and there's Hillary Clinton adopts an alien baby. I mean, there's some news that like is inadvertently in your face. You're just like, dismiss it, right? But there's a lot of other fake news that is a little bit harder to recognize on the onset, especially when we trust who's putting it out for us. So this is a very famous headline about the destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy. Does this ring bells? Have you, yes, nods, maybe. Sometimes fake news does not have huge consequences. Sometimes it has massive consequences. And so I saw a lot of recognition, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this incident, but essentially what happened was there was news put out into the United States in a time of very high tension that this enemy, Spain, had damaged, exploded, attacked one of our military ships and sunk it. Later on, it was found that it was an internal explosion that sunk it, but it was just this, there was so much tension, they needed one spark, and that spark was fake news that erupted into a whole war. And so I put both of these up here to kind of show both ends of the spectrum. Both are important. Some are easier to dismiss, but others like this, if we could just take that breath and pause, could have real-world ramifications. So I really like this cartoon. I knew it was chicken that comes first, because we talk about fake news. What is it? What comes first, news or fake news, right? And there's the old adage of the lies are already halfway around the world before the truth can put its boots on kind of thing. And so I just think it's funny. We know this, so why are we talking about it so much now? If we think back to the evolution of information, how people access information, I mean, grand, global scale. If we look back to the Dark Ages, we had a monk that would spend months to produce a single book. And so many people were not literate, could not read, and so were dependent on these key leaders in their community to get their information. Well, enter in this famous invention, the Gutenberg printing press. That was this key moment in history that took very limited access of information and opened the door to so much more access. It sparked, religious movements, Reformation, and we've only sped up from there. We've only accelerated, and now we're looking at from Gutenberg to Zuckerberg. Zuckerberg is with Facebook. And if you look at all of the different touch points that we have, it's very easy to become overwhelmed. We have more than 24-hour news cycle. We have perpetual news cycle if we choose to subscribe to it. And so thinking about how much information we have, how much information is not verified, it's not accurate, it's that blatant fake news like the Hillary Clinton alien baby or the person back from the dead. Why don't we limit fake news? This could be an entirely different lecture. There are debates and lectures and theoretical, philosophical papers about why don't we limit fake news. But at the core of it, why don't we limit fake news? What is a thought that you would have just immediately coming to your mind? Why don't we limit it?
Censorship.
Censorship?
I think people don't even know it's fake news sometimes.
Sometimes you don't know it's fake news.
Who's the judge?
Who's the judge?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the core of almost every single argument out there, is who's the judge, and you have entries in of these ideas of, well, if it's hate speech, if it's threatening, and we've gone through so many different Supreme Court decisions about, well, what can you limit, what can you not? And something that I thought was really interesting, so we go back to, it's the First Amendment. It's not the 10th Amendment, it's not the 27th Amendment, it's the very First Amendment in the foundation of our country, is that we will have access to information. We will have freedom of speech and freedom of the press. And so we always have to go back to that core ideal. And something that I think is important to remember, especially, hindsight is 20/20, over the course of history, if you go back to the abolitionist movement, who does decide? Because for so many people in that society, if I were to tell you that someone who has darker skin than me is equal in intelligence, in rights, in emotions, it would have been fake news to some people. They would have said that cannot be true. There was these scientific studies looking at skulls and all of these things. And so that's such a blatant example of well, obviously we wouldn't have wanted to limit that. But it becomes so murky. And I think so I was in a panel, on a panel in Helena a couple months ago that was talking about looking at the rise of white supremacy and neo-Nazism and what role does the press and journalists, what do they play in that? And one gentleman in the audience stood up during the question and answer when we'd gotten far past the core discussion and just said, I really missed almost like the good old days of journalism when, let's say, these key friends, like Peter Jennings or Diane Sawyer or whoever it was your person delivering you the daily news, and that was your set of facts. And then everybody could have their different opinions off of these facts, right? And he said, I really miss everybody having the same foundation of facts to then discuss. And now he's like, I don't even know what my foundation is. I have no foundation. And it was interesting because we got into this for a while, and I think there was a lot of nostalgia about the news, but I was the only person that's lived through this maybe transition as an informative time of my life, where I remember watching Peter Jennings on CBS Evening News with my mom. I've had that experience. I was very young, granted, but I have been part of this evolution of information and social media and access to Google and the internet. And when I wrote a research paper, I had to go to the library and read it. I remember this, right? And for me, having this as a foundation of my adult experience, it was harder for me to get lost in the nostalgia of the past news, even though I can understand where it was coming from. I'm much more excited about it, because if you think about, yes, we had a foundation of facts, but the facts were coming from a very privileged white perspective. And as much as journalists would try to cover the untold story, it was always limited by this perspective. And now that we have this open flood of information, yes, there's so much more to absorb, and it can feel like you're drowning sometimes, but we're hearing all these voices that weren't part of the discussion before. And that's something else that I like to keep in mind when looking at the news, that it's worth it to me. It's worth it to hear people who didn't have a voice even 15 years ago, who can have a platform and a voice now. And if we look at events like the Arab Spring, almost a decade ago, I guess now, we're looking at this mobilization of an oppressed people using social media to be heard. And that, to me, is exciting. So I like to come back to this principle, but I also like to come back to that idea of not getting too lost in the nostalgia and remembering that this is a privilege. And so, again, I like to talk about why journalism matters, and a lot of these things, I mean, we have something very dated, we have something very recent, but neither of these things were popular ideas. And they radically changed our lives today because they were able to speak in the press. And even something as simple as, not simple, that was not the right statement, as considering the delisting of the grizzly bear has been a contentious topic, and we wouldn't even know about it. We wouldn't even know we had the privilege to comment on it, to weigh in, if it weren't for just someone giving us that information, because we can't be in all the places all at the same time. So with that foundation, now I want to talk about some tools to navigating the news when you're digesting it, and some of these are going to work for you and some aren't, and we can kind of work as we go because it's three of us. But here are the three things I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to talk about news neighborhoods. I'm going to talk about this acronym VIA. And then one resource, which is Snopes. And I think that's pretty common that most people know about Snopes now, but I'm going to talk about it a little bit too. This is going to look academic, but it doesn't need to. This is how I organize in my brain when I'm taking in information. So we don't have to fill this out all together, but I do want to talk about these 5 neighborhoods. So if you think of these 5 things, journalism, entertainment, promotion, propaganda, and raw information as houses on your block. And you try to say, okay, when I'm taking in this information, whatever it might be, wherever I'm accessing it, which house does it fit best under? They're all part of the same neighborhood. There's going to be some overlap of all of them. Maybe the yards are connected, but there's one house that fits better for this piece of information. And so I do want to walk through the goals a little bit. We don't need to necessarily fill out everything else, but I do want to walk through the goals because that's what helps anchor in these houses. So with journalism, we've talked a lot about it. We've talked about education, access to information. We've talked about having someone there to help us be educated and to understand the facts of our world a little bit better. But what about entertainment? What are some goals? And let's talk about some positive and negative outcomes of entertainment news.
I guess figuring out what stars are doing what or something.
Okay, what stars are doing what? Yeah.
Explain about different movies that are out there, different books. Yeah, books.
And no one else has to. I mean, you can weigh in as you want to. But yeah, so entertainment, I mean, it's fun. Entertainment brings me joy. I love art. I was in theater for years. I love reading about the philosophy behind a certain playwright's initiative, and they're drawing on these lessons from this time in history and making it applicable now. Like, I love that. I nerd out on that sort of stuff. I love learning about musicians coming to town, like where did they grow up, why did they learn. So I think one outcome of entertainment is that it brings a lot of joy. And yeah, it is. It's still information. It's still educating me, but it's not going to fit in my journalism house. Even though there's entertainment journalism, it's not going to be my news house, my journalism house. What about promotion? I forgot to tell you what I do now. I work at a marketing agency.
Advertising?
Well, there's some advertising in there, yep. What could it be some other elements of promotion? What are we doing tonight? We're having a community lecture. It's education. We're talking about journalism. You heard about it somehow. So that's promotion as well, right? So like PR, a new restaurant is opening, like that's still giving you information for your life. It's informing your world, but there's an intended outcome of you will become a customer. You will become a participant. You will show up and activate in some way. So another way to look at this is, what do they want out of you, right? They want you to come and support. They want you to buy this product. Looking at propaganda, that's a pretty charged word. It often is accompanied with government information that's disseminated. And a lot of times that word is charged in a negative way. We talk about propaganda as like something that's maybe meant to brainwash us, but it's also meant to garner support. And that support can be bonds in the war. It can be supporting neo-Nazism. I mean, you have to look at where it's coming from and what it's asking of you, yet again. Raw information?
Is that firsthand?
Yeah, it's just without any filter. Absolutely, it's firsthand. So it's looking at the Excel spreadsheet of your figures for the month without any sort of graphs or write-up to tell you what those numbers mean. And what are what's the goal of raw information?
Try and present the information without commentary, and then hopefully be less biased because of that.
Kind of giving you that first-hand access if someone's putting out the raw information. Like, think about, this is not raw information, but it's adjacent, like the WikiLeaks was just, here's all this information. Just dumping raw information or all this information to say, you decide. And there is some value in that. There's real value to be able to go back to the source yourself. But like we already established at the beginning, we don't have time for that. I mean, I'm up here talking to you about this, and I will tell you my news access is so limited. I listen to the radio on my way to work, and I have like 2 little email things that come in that are my like skimming headlines with a quick synopsis, and if I have time, I might click and read the full story. We don't have time. Or we choose not to have time because we have to work. We have relationships in our life. We have to exercise. We have to cook, right? So raw information can be really nice to have access to verify something else, but to have it through the lens of journalism is really nice. So this is really small, and we don't have to read this at all. But this is what we already kind of talked about. This is the grid filled in. So I'm just going to go through the goals and the outcomes a little bit, but we've already talked about the purpose of journalism. The real goal is to inform and educate. For entertainment, I really think it's to amuse, to engage people, and leisure activities, to bring community together, I think, is really a result of some entertainment news. Promotion, we talked about to sell goods, services, your participation. Propaganda, to build mass support for an ideology. And then raw information is really to bypass all these filters and to just give it to you. Practitioners, well, we have some, it says under here, looking at the outcomes, not the practitioners. We already talked about practitioners. The outcomes is empowering people to educate themselves, giving you information through this curated, hopefully fact-checked and easy-to-digest lens so that you can decide for yourself how you feel about it. Entertainment, sometimes a lot is a distraction. It can be informational. It can reinforce or critique social norms. So that's something else to think about with that sort of house. Promotion, increased sales. Propaganda, again, it just is going to help build momentum and motivation towards an ideology and hopefully actualize movement towards it. And then raw information is really that outlet for self-expression, and it can manifest in a lot of different ways. So the reason I like these 5 houses, essentially, is because there is so much information coming to us at such amounts and speeds and volumes that when we first take it in, we need to start sorting. And for me, I sort these 4 houses very separately than I sort my journalism house. I take in entertainment news and I go, that might educate me, but I'm not going to base my life decisions off of any of these 4 houses. Maybe the raw data if I have some time, but I'm not going to base my life off this raw data until I've had time to analyze it. And so when something comes into me, if it fits in one of these 4 houses, I take it with a grain of salt. I take it when I want to take it. I read it when I want to read it. This is the one house that when I say, okay, it really is striking a chord for me that this is journalism, then I have follow-up questions. So think of these neighborhoods as your initial sort. Have you guys ever seen the change machines? where you dump in all of your coins and it filters out starting with like smallest or biggest to smallest. This is kind of what we're doing here. We're getting all the quarters out of the way. And then we're going to dive in a little bit more till we can get to our smallest dime. I don't know why the dime's the smallest. So I just want to do a couple practices of just getting through some of these like quick initial sorts for the houses. So this is a little old, but not too old. It says 2019 Super Bowl food, 15 popular Super Bowl party snacks ranked from worst to first. And just so you can see that number 15 is quiche as like the worst thing you could bring in the top 15 list, and 14 is chicken wings. So just really quickly off the bat, if you had to sort this into one of your houses, where would you put this? Entertainment? Not. Okay, is there like a quick reason why you would do this? This isn't like, isn't it really important that you know that quiche, you should not bring quiche? Wouldn't that change your life? No, everyone's like, no. You're right. So this is off of, CBS. This is a news outlet, but it's under sports, which still is journalism. There's a lot of sports journalists that take offense when you discount what they do because there's huge, huge things in sports. But this particular piece, much more entertaining. And what is it trying to do?
Get you wrapped up to watch the game.
Get you to participate in watching the game. So there's a little bit of promotion there too. What about this one? It says current conditions. We have humidity 80%, wind speed calm, wind chill 36, 36 degrees out.
Raw information.
Good? Is that good information. And you said raw information. So if I were going to put it in a house, I'd put it in my raw information house. This impacts my life, and yes, I am trusting at some point someone disseminated all of the really raw data off the satellites and all of that for me, but this is still raw information. I just am going to take that in without anybody telling me what I should feel with this information and use it to inform my day. So I'm going to discount that. The weather. So we did this interesting exercise. I used to teach a news literacy class at the university, and we would have a news blackout for students for 24 hours as part of an exercise, and they couldn't do anything that would give them information. Like no social media, nothing, and we would ask them to like write about their experience and what do they miss. No one missed anything except for the weather. That was the one thing all people said they missed. And I was just like, God, I don't even check the weather. I was the one person in this like 80-person classroom, and I was like, I never look at the weather. I do now. Sometimes if I'm planning. I like to be surprised. Okay, this one is off of Twitter, and it's at the handle BitterrootNF, and it says, heads up, crews are still burning in the Ambrose drainage this weekend to reduce residual slash from recent thinning, and timber harvest operations improve wildlife habitat and site prep for planting. Where would we put this one? Journalism?
It's good news to know, if you're going in that area.
Okay, news, yeah.
It's news, but it also does come with a conclusion about why.
So let's stop and start at the very beginning. Who's it coming from? Can you see? It's hard to see. I'm sorry. It has the U.S. the Forest Service logo up there, and it's the Bitterroot National Forest. So it is coming from the government. It is giving us really good information so that we're not freaked out, that we know why things are burning. But there is that one line that you saw, to improve wildlife habitat and site prep. So if you live in the western United States, you know forest management, there is not agreement. There is not agreement about our past forest management or current forest management procedures. There's always new and better ways to do it. And so it's just interesting just to look at the lens of who's giving you this information. And it doesn't mean that you discount it at all. You just say, oh, there's one little layer, though, that you want us to think you're doing a good thing. And maybe you are. I'm not saying that like all so this is where that propaganda, that word is charged and often skews negative. In this case, I don't think it skews negative, but it's still propaganda. Also news, same neighborhood. All of these houses have to do with news, but I'm going to put this in my propaganda house, even though it's giving me more information. And I'm going to judge it a little less harshly than like my journalism, like, okay, where did you get this? But I'm still going to know this is a stakeholder in this information. We'll just do a couple more. This one may or may not be obvious, but it has a man all alone and then a man with a dog, and it says, a dog makes your life happier. Adopt. Where would you put this one? Promotion.
I think that I
But I think they're right. Yeah, they very obviously have pedigree in the corner because they want you to buy their dog food. That is the ultimate goal of this ad, is to buy their dog food. They would also like you to adopt and have your life be happy, but the goal is to buy the dog food. So it's always nice to just see with these two especially, the first thing your eye can go to is who is telling you this information. And then why are they telling you that information? To make themselves look better, but to give you information. It's also a responsibility of the government to get you to buy the dog food. So this one is in Russian, so I can't read it to you, but it is President Putin signing a picture of himself for a little girl. This is on his personal Twitter, so right there we can say, okay, it's a government official putting this out, and he would like to garner support. That's the goal of this piece of information. And we, as the Americans, have a very charged view of Putin. We just do. It doesn't matter what you think of Putin, you have a charged view of Putin. And so it's pretty obvious, and so is this, right? This is pretty obviously, like, we can look at that and be like, that's war propaganda. And this is very, like, scary. Don't let that shadow touch them. Buy war bonds, trying to garner the support. But then we've seen some less obvious examples of propaganda. So this is yet another one of looking at who's putting it out. Well, NASA. NASA has federal funding. And just like a side tangent, it's interesting because they don't have to be directly from the government to still have to cater to a certain point of view when there's federal funding involved. So I have worked in the past where we have had to change our language around climate change or whatever else we're promoting because we get federal dollars and we don't want to piss off the administration. And so we are going to change our language, not our core mission, not our vision, not what we're doing, but we are going to change our language. And so again, just seeing where people are associated, this is just saying, did you know we've had this teacher on board, there's going to be a live chat, like you can ask them about space. Super cool. Just having that other lens of saying this isn't propaganda, but it's propaganda adjacent. There's some federal dollars involved that might skew the message. So we don't have to go through all of these. I do want to touch on images, though, because that's a whole other layer that is really important, because there's this, I think, trust sometimes when we can see it, we can believe it. I mean, that's something that we say all the time. If I see it, I'll believe it. And so, not anymore. Exactly, that's why we're talking about it, yeah.
They've got programs, computer programs, that can manipulate photos and video now.
Right. And so we're looking at two different photos here. This is from the tsunami in Indonesia that was last fall. And then this is from Hurricane Harvey, which is 2 years old. But looking at these two images, why would you trust or distrust them? So this one just says the damage after the earthquake and tsunami is pictured in Palu, central Indonesia. And then this one says, believe it or not, this is a shark on the freeway in Houston, Texas, Hurricane Harvey.
It's hard to trust pictures anymore because they can be photoshopped.
Yeah. So something else to think about, I know there's so many things to think about, is what we talked about at the very beginning, what you touched on, is you're going to get your information through someone else's lens. Quite literally, with photojournalism. And so what maybe a photo isn't doctored at all. I mean, we have that whole layer of thinking about Photoshop and all this, but a really famous example, and I don't have it here, but a really famous example that's become iconic in our recent past is the toppling of the Saddam Hussein statue. I feel like for the most part we've all seen that with the ropes, right? And it looks like a big mob is taking down a statue. Well, if you go back and look at that, there actually weren't that many people there that day, but are a couple people pulling a statue down going to make a front page? And so there's a big there's a separation in the photojournalism world of accurate portrayal. And there's kind of two camps. And I'm oversimplifying, but to oversimplify, there's two camps. And one of them is saying, I will literally represent to you exactly what I see in front of me. I'm going to stand here and see my 6 people pulling this down. I'm not saying it's 6. I'm just for the case of my point. There's another camp that says, I am accurately going to represent the feeling, the sentiment, the bigger story of what is happening. And that, to me, is positioning this way. Neither are wrong and neither are right. They're different. They're very different. And as you start to follow news and photographers and publications, for National Geographic, you're never going to have a non-beautiful image in that magazine. And some of those are going to be staged. Not because that situation or that image was false, but because they didn't get it right. So, hey, can you actually move in a little bit? We're going to come back and do this when the light is better. This actually happened like yesterday, but the light wasn't good. It was stormy, so we're all going to come recreate this moment today. And that's going to be beautiful and represent this this story accurately. There's another campus saying, well, it was raining that day, so the picture's going to look crappy because that's what it really was. And so it's hard to think about that, but there's a whole level of ethics involved in just literally capturing a photo without any doctoring at all. And so for this one, something that you could ask yourself is this the only thing ruined in Indonesia and they needed to catch ruin and so they found this one spot? Or is this really indicative of the larger picture of the damage in Indonesia? Something that you can help yourself do, and we're going to get into this with our tools some more, but I'll bring it up here now, is consult multiple sources. That's one of the best ways you can figure that out. Is what are other news outlets reporting? What are other journalists capturing? And if it's a big enough story, there's going to be more than one person telling you this story. And that's one way to really start to paint yourself the bigger picture because we're always going to be seeing it through someone else's lens. Another thing I recommend is following people you trust. And that's just going to take some time and some diligence on our part to look into what are they telling, have they been consistently accurate, sorry, I don't know if you wanted to come in or not, and really starting to trust your editors and your publication. And all of them are going to get it wrong at some point, all of them. But if they're an ethical, reputable publication, they're going to come back and tell you how they got it wrong. And so one of the second biggest things you can do is follow the news story. So maybe all these damaged pictures are coming out, but in 3 days they're like, you know what, it actually wasn't as widespread as we thought. You have to continue to follow. For the second one, there's some common sense and there's some also follow-up. If you start paying attention, you will note that anytime a major city floods, you're going to see this picture. It is not a real picture. This picture is photoshopped and it's funny and people reactionary share. Because it's funny, but it becomes news when more people share it because it's that reaction. And so if you could take one thing away from this presentation tonight, it would be to pause and to breathe and digest. Just giving yourself that space. We live in such a fast-paced world that the space is what I really would want you to take home tonight. And you can see so much clearly when you just have a moment. And you continue to follow and take in the bigger picture. And we already talked about the option to Photoshop. So sometimes it can be funny, like the shark. That's not really going to ruin anybody's life that I can tell. I mean, make your own case. But sometimes it really can. And so right after the Nice terrorist attacks, there was this gentleman who, it's hard to see, but this is an iPad. And he's doing a very my generation thing and he looks good today, right? So he's going to take a selfie in the mirror because he's looking good. And he's a Sikh, which is a religious sect where they wear like a turban. But someone took this, they photoshopped the iPad to be a Quran, they photoshopped a bomb jacket on, and it got picked up in this chaos of the Nice terrorist attacks when everyone just wants information. We just want answers because we're scared. And we want information to calm us down and to tell us what's going on and what we should do. And news outlets want to give that to us. That's what they're there for. They want to give us information selfishly and unselfishly. That's like the diligence, but it's also they need to be first to keep in business. And so a news outlet actually picked up this photo without doing their due diligence, and it happens. It does happen. And sometimes it's unintentional. They're just trying to get information, and someone fed this, and they're putting it out before the editor and the fact checker have time to catch up. And so this poor guy was actually like hunted down for a little while as like the attacker until someone said, this is an iPad, and this is not real. But it escalates so quickly in breaking news, especially with so many attacks, that, again, that breath. If that editor had just taken that breath before sharing that photo, maybe this poor guy's life wouldn't have been so awful for a while.
But isn't that also an ignorance on the editor's part because the Sikh are not Muslims?
Yeah, but they might not know. Right, so if they had the breath, if they'd had...
I mean, that really is kind of an iconic Sikh feature, that turban. It's not in many of it.
Well, and who knows, right? Who knows who's publishing their media? Absolutely.
As soon as I would see that turban and then see a Quran, I would be going, okay, wait, there's something wrong here. Double check.
Yeah.
But the fact that the editor didn't, that's kind of an ignorance on their part, wouldn't you say, when they allowed that to go through?
I would again say that giving the space would help, because I will tell you that lots of people wouldn't see that, those two religious symbols, and know that they were different. And it is an ignorance part, and that part of that balancing out the ignorance is taking the time to research. So absolutely, like, it was an error, it was awful, absolutely. And so what we can do is, as the consumer of that, is take the space that the editor should have taken and not share it. That's like where we can help. We can't always help with what actually is coming out. So we've kind of talked about these original filters, right? And we've tried to just get to our dimes, which is our news, right? And so now that we know we're just in the journalism house, we just have our news, we don't have to worry about anything else. Well, let's talk a little bit about the next layer of analyzing and how to more accurately make sure that we're understanding. So we've talked about this a lot already. In the 24-hour news cycle, these organizations have to constantly be covering something. They have nothing else to fill their time. They must be covering something that's so interesting that you will not look away if you can help it. And sometimes this is hilarious. There was a big Supreme Court decision, I think it was the one about marriage equality a couple years ago, and they're waiting for the Supreme Court decision to be handed down. If you have ever looked at a Supreme Court decision, it is just massive. There is no short, easy to understand Supreme Court decision. And so there's this guy on like the steps of the Supreme Court, and he's like, any minute now we're going to be hearing from the judges like about marriage equality and the decision. And you see this staffer run up and hand him this volume, and he's on 24-hour cable TV. He has to keep covering it. So he's like, so it looks like he's trying to interpret this for us, like this poor guy. I mean, it's so funny, but it's awful. It's awful because the 24-hour news cycle, what it does is it's constantly just pushing and pushing and pushing all this other stuff and not giving us the time and the depth of analysis that the editor should have had before posting that picture, that this poor reporter should have had to read through the decision before telling us. I mean, that's raw information at that point, right? And so each of these organizations, we have like CNN and Fox, which are the two dominating cable, big ideological, they tend to skew, you know, a little bit more liberal and conservative. We've got the New York Times, which tends to be a little bit more liberal. National Geographic puts out news every day too. They're trying to compete with these maybe stock companies that we go to for news. They're still trying to put out news for us. Radio news there's a little less competition for, but there's still competition for constant coverage. We've got to have something to tell you. So the number one tip that I have for you is that in breaking news, newsletters will get it wrong. They're going to get it wrong. They might not get the whole story wrong, they will get something wrong. And part of that comes as being a journalist who's also trying to understand what's happening in that moment as a person who can only absorb and talk to so many people. And I want to talk about that a little bit more. We're going to get into that, but I'm just going to give you a couple tips to really just hone in on for breaking news. And the first one is to not trust anonymous sources, because big news brings out fakers, brings out people who aren't informed, but I mean, worst case scenario, you're in an attack situation and someone's running by you and you're like, what's happening? They don't know what's happening either. They can give you another little piece of the puzzle, but if they don't have expertise, they don't give you a name, don't trust what they're saying unless there's a really good reason that they're anonymous. And we'll talk about anonymous sources too. One thing that I don't like is when stories reference another news outlet as their source, because it means they're not there. And so another flag is don't trust stories that cite another news outlet, because that means that they don't have their own people on the ground, they don't have their own editors in the mix. They're saying so-and-so is saying, and that at that point starts to become a game of telephone. Sometimes unavoidable. If you're CNN and only a local, like Missoulian, is reporting this huge story in Missoula, you have to say the Missoulian reported. Or, for example, I hear all the time on MTPR, the Missoulian reported today, blah, 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 blah. Because they don't have enough reporters to go report it either. So that's not maybe breaking news, but you can have that in your lens too. Pay attention to the language used. So I'm going to put all four of these up here and talk about each of them. So when someone's on the prompter or whatever and they're saying, we are receiving reports, it means they are giving you the information the second that they're getting it. We're receiving reports, we're receiving a Supreme Court decision. It means they have not had time to judge it, to digest it, to fact check it, or any of it. We are seeking confirmation. That's a big one. They're trying to be transparent, telling you they don't know yet, but they're giving you what they have. And this is kind of in that raw information house where we have to decide for ourselves. We don't know if it's hearsay. We don't know if it's been fact-checked. And so in breaking news, when you're hearing those two, A and B, I would be very cautious about letting that news inform your life. The second two, you can have a little bit more confidence in. We can confirm. Okay, they've got something, and if you trust this news outlet, you're trying to trust their confirmation. They've checked with somebody, and they feel confident that this is accurate. We have learned a little more ambiguous, but still they're saying, okay, we've learned this thing, and we feel confident enough to tell you. So it's little changes in language, but it's in breaking news, you're wanting to have as many little flags and checklists as you can. This goes just with number two, but to call it out on its own, look for news outlets close to the incident. Number one, because yes, they're going to probably have someone on the ground who has the bigger picture. But number two, because they know the community a lot better than someone coming in to cover the big story knows the community. So, for example, I'm trying to think of something recent that happened. Gosh, everything happens all the time. Let's just say New Zealand. That was a big one. There was a terrorist attack in Christchurch, New Zealand. I am going to listen much more closely to the local news outlet in Christchurch for how that's affecting people and what happened than I am the CNN reporter who flew in to cover it, right? Because they have a different understanding of the community, how the community works, who this person might be, how they're going to react. And that's another value that they bring being close, is they're more likely to digest and give you that information accurately because they have the context that maybe I wouldn't have if I were coming in to cover. And that was something when I was in Vietnam that we had to talk about a lot, of the ethics of me being a foreigner and outsider covering information in Vietnam. And so I relied very heavily on researchers at the university in Vietnam to help me understand the information in the context of culture. They have a very different relationship to time and space and community than we do in a typical American household. And so a lot of journalists, if they're dropping in off the ground, they're going to be bringing locals into the story with them to make sure that they're getting it right. Just a couple more. So what we already talked about, well, I'll put these two together, is to compare multiple sources. That's one of the best things you can do in breaking news, knowing that people are getting it wrong. Well, okay, is NPR and Fox News and CNN, are they all saying the same thing? Because if they are, I'm more likely to believe that than if only NPR is reporting this one thing and no one else is talking about it. One thing that have you ever watched Shark Week? Or have you heard of Shark Week? Yes, no? Have you heard of Shark Week? Okay, well, I'm a huge ocean nerd. I love Shark Week. I don't have cable TV, but if I'm like house sitting or one of my friends does, I am there for Shark Week. And it's Discovery. What they do is every 1 week a year, they just put out all of these documentaries about sharks and the ocean, and there's always one about great whites jumping, and they're like, how many different ways can you tell this, right? But it's so fun. I love Shark Week. And what they're known for is putting out these really beautifully produced cinematographic pieces of information about sharks, about habitat, and all these things. And so I was house sitting, it was like 2 or 3 years ago, and I was so excited because it was Shark Week. And I turned on the TV, and I missed the first maybe 3 minutes of this program, and it's about Megalodon. And she's hitting her head back there because you know what I'm talking about. So it's about Megalodon, which is this prehistoric shark. They found these fossils, and oh my God, Megalodon is made this appearance in South America or South Africa off the coast, and they hour-long documentary. And these scientists are there, and these researchers, and they're tagging it. And I was like, how have we never known about this? I mean, it's just it was a life-changing moment for me. And I was like, how have I not heard about this before? So I immediately jump on my phone, and I'm searching Megalodon. Silence. No one else is talking about Megalodon. It's what is going on Discovery Channel? Because I go to you as a source of information and science, and all of their stuff is very informative. Well, I should have been there for the very first minute of the documentary when they said this is a mockumentary. This is fake documentary. They told you right up front, but if you tuned in, like I did, 2 or 3 minutes late, they never mentioned it again. It wasn't after the commercial break that they were just a reminder, this is fake, this is a imagined thing, and they got so much flack for it. But my gut reaction was saying, this is huge, how have I not heard about this? Wait a minute, no one else is talking about this. And that, to me, was the biggest flag in that moment of trying to cross-reference this breaking news that was debuting on Discovery Channel. How in the world did I not know about this? Oh, because it was fake. And so that's one of my favorite stories about me getting duped by fake news and being really excited about it. And big news brings out fakers and photoshoppers, which we've already talked about. And part of that is on us to be really aware of reflexive retweeting and sharing. And so this one is was shared and followed by so many people. It's a picture. It's kind of hard to see. I don't know if you can tell from back there, but this is water. And it says La Vida Bella Nursing Home in Dickinson, Texas is almost underwater with nursing home patients. And this was during one of the big rain floods in Texas. First of all, this is a very convincing photo. Like, if you were to look at this on your tablet or your desktop or your phone, it looks very convincingly real. I mean, you're seeing these like poor elderly people just like sitting in water. So the common sense flags come up. You're like, are you kidding? They would be taking a picture. They would be evacuating these people. Is anybody else covering this poor nursing home? No, no one else is covering this. Why would someone do this though, right? It's entertaining to show off their skills. Who knows why they're doing this? But you're starting to look at these like, okay, be aware of reflexive retweeting. This is probably big news, like this huge flood. It's going to bring out shark photoshopping and nursing home photoshopping. And so it's on us to take that step back and be like, why is no one else talking about Megalodon? And looking at this. So, funny story with like a real situation that just happened like last year. And like I said, one of the biggest things you can do beyond just having that initial filter is to follow, follow, follow. And so this is an example of just last September. I get little updates on my phone, and I subscribe to the Times and BBC. That's just who I get updates from, and sometimes other places. But you can even see, so this one was during the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation. And so you have the New York Times saying, the woman who accused Judge Brett Kavanaugh of sexual assault revealed her identity and gave details of the episode to the Washington Post. Just 1 minute before this one came up from BBC saying, correction. Woman who says she was assaulted by U.S. Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh tells the Washington Post of the alleged incident, ... Well, we can already tell that they got something wrong in this quick decision to be first. I didn't even get a screenshot of what they got wrong. I don't even think I got it delivered. But something you can start to do is start looking at those sources that you trust and trusting them enough to issue a correction when they're wrong. It's embarrassing, but they should do it if they are ethically living up to their standards to give you accurate information. And if I had turned off my thing, I would have never seen that correction if I had not followed it. Another one is to look at, like, this is breaking news where the New York Times says nearly 400 people were killed when an earthquake and tsunami struck. So this is, again, the Indonesia incident. BBC says at least 384. So they're pretty close. I've got my multiple sources, nearly 400, at least 384. So they're pretty close, so I can get an accurate estimate. This is, I think this is 2 days before this post, which said at least 832 people, right? So the number doubled in just 2 days as they're uncovering more information. And so it's important for me, if I had stopped following it at this middle panel, I would believe, oh, the tsunami hit, 400 people were killed. And I mean, by the end of it, it was more than 800. Right, so you're continuing to grow your picture as the journalists and editors and researchers are also continuing to uncover facts. What time is it? Okay, we're almost done. Do you have a few more minutes? Yeah. Okay. So one other thing I like to do, so we did our big sorting of houses, and then we were looking if it's breaking news, and we're trying to cover it all the time. And one other tool that we have is this acronym called VIA, which is a signpost along the way when we're trying to figure out where we're going and what we should trust and what we should pay attention to. And the question is it verified, independent, and accountable? And so what I mean by that is verified. Is it fact-checked? Is there supporting evidence? Does the journalist provide you reports? Does it reference the sources where it got this information? Does the source reference why they know this information? So that's verified. Is it independent? So looking at those news houses again, this is where it can help you with that. Are there stakeholders giving this information? First of all, look at who's putting it out, who's the author, who's the publication. If there's no stakeholders there, the next tier is to look at in the story. It doesn't mean you should discount what they're saying, but is the source, do they have a stake in the story they're telling you? Whether it's a reputation or something like that, and that helps a little bit. And then accountable. And that is just at the onset, like, who's telling this to you? Can you contact them? And I'll tell you, every reputable journalist will have a way to contact them. It will either be through their editor or through their personal email, but they will have a way. And so that's just like an easy way to just be like, is this a real person? Can I contact them? And that helps you know if it's accountable and who's telling you this story. So we're going to practice with a really contentious news story. Is Jennifer Aniston finally pregnant? Linda, I know you care about this. She does not care about it. But the reason I bring this one up is because it's just a beautiful example. So we've got this, is Jennifer Aniston finally pregnant? The star cradles her growing baby bump by Nikki Black. So we've already checked off one of our 3 things. Verified, independent, accountable. Nikki Black. And I'm going to skip down the page. Nikki Black. She's got a bio. She has a link to email her and a tweet to follow her. She's a real person. I checked it out for you. Accountable. Check. So we have 2 things left to figure out. Is it verified and independent? So let's go back to independent. So new idea. I will tell you I scoped out their website. They have no connection to Jennifer Aniston. They put out celebrity news. This is what they do. So yes, they want you to read their news, but they're not connected to any celebrity. They're not connected to Babies R Us. They are pretty independent. So we have checked off 2 of our 3 things. So verified is the last thing we need to know. Is this real news? And so as we're going through this, we're not going to read it all. There's pictures. She's maybe cradling her baby bump, right? They're showing us some visual evidence, maybe. But the one thing that I really want to get to is that reading this whole article, you will say, like these quotes you see, she has told some close friends that she can't wait to finally show off her bump and share the happy news with her fans, who she knows have also waited so long for her to get her dream ending, reveals a source. And then later on in the article, it talks about adds the source. I think there was rumors are flying. So once you get through this entire article, you're like, there's not a single person in this article who I could understand, like, are they her sister? Have they met her before? Who is this source? And it goes back to not trusting anonymous sources unless there's a very good reason. And one of the best reasons is, well, we've talked, okay, so what are some, well, I won't make you answer this. I'll talk. You all both know this. But I want to talk about it just because sometimes I think it helps bring it to light. We looked at something really recently where there was a Washington memo released that talked about, it was by an anonymous source, that talked about the true nature of President Donald Trump. And that was anonymous. It came out 2 months ago, a couple, maybe more than that. And there was these 2 camps, the Democrats and the Republicans, who had very different interpretations of if that source was valid being anonymous. There was one camp saying, well, this is an anonymous source, like this Jennifer Aniston story. Who is it? I'm not going to trust it until you tell me who it is and why I should trust them and what are their credentials. There was another camp saying, well, of course it's valid that they're anonymous because if they name themselves, there's going to be repercussions, they're going to lose their job, there could be threats against them. They're both super valid camps. And this is the point where you, as the consumer of news, have to start to decide, well, who's reporting this? I think it was the Times who had this memo, or maybe it was the Post, and maybe it was both. I apologize, I don't remember. But it was one of those really big newspapers. And so that's when you start to say, okay, I followed this news source for a long time. I either trust them or I don't. I either trust this editor or I don't. And if they say that they have fact-checked this and gotten it to the point where they feel comfortable releasing it, and I don't think that there's a political agenda behind it, then I'm going to start really looking at this information seriously. If I followed this source for a long time and I don't trust it, then I'm going to be very much more suspicious about this news. So I'm not telling you to trust the Times or not. I'm telling you if you have followed the Times for a long time, or whoever is reporting it, I'm using the Times because it's very easy to call that to mind. But if you're following the Green Shirt newspaper, well, the Green Shirt newspaper has gotten so many things wrong that, like, no, I'm not going to give them this validity of having an anonymous source. But the Red Shirt paper has. And so I'm going to pay much more attention and trust these editors, like with Deep Throat and Watergate. You had to trust those editors, that they did their job, and the reporters that they did their job. And the way they got that was by delivering again and again and again, and also giving you really good reasons why the source was anonymous. So there's a recent example and an old example of anonymous sources. The Jennifer Aniston example, it's not a good enough reason for them to be anonymous. There's no repercussion I can think of that would validate having an anonymous source talking about Jennifer Aniston's pregnancy. So I'm going to bring these all up at once. This is my last tool, and then we'll be done. Evaluating sources. So we start at the top tier with sorting into our different houses. Then we looked at the second level, which is via. Was it verified, independent, and accurate? And then I can start looking at the final tier, which is my sources in the story. So I'm hoping the journalist did their due diligence and got the best sources for the job, but sometimes, and I can tell you from experience, it's really hard to get someone to call you back on deadline. And my editor is saying, this is going to print whether you're done or not at 11 because I have a paper to fill. And I have to deliver this for my publisher and to keep our doors open and give you a paycheck. And I'm calling like 5 different people, and I'm like, I just need you to comment on this story. I need another source to tell me if I got this right. I need you to weigh in because I'm talking about you. I mean, I am trying so hard. And so knowing that, sometimes the journalist thinks that, oh, great, I got the right person, and maybe they didn't, or maybe they're missing somebody too. And so something that, like, this is just another mnemonic device. I'm vain, and I don't expect you to remember that at all, but the core of it is to evaluate the sources. And again, you're going to see some independent, verified, accountable type things in here, which we've already talked about, but there's some other layers. So are they independent? Again, does this source have an interest in this story? And I actually would hope so. On most stories, I hope they have an interest, because if they don't, why are you talking to them, really? If they don't have some sort of interest or specialty, like, why are they in your story? So if they're not independent, you don't have to discount them. You just have to take what they're telling you with a different weight, if that makes sense. Multiple. This one's really big. Are there 2 or more people saying the same thing? It's just like looking at multiple news outlets covering it. Well, if there's only one person saying that turtles are actually sharks. Okay, well, if there's only one person saying that, there's no scientist, and there's nothing like this, then I'm going to discount what they're saying, right? But if there's 5 people saying, you know what, actually, we've just discovered, like, they have gills, and they're really sharks, well, I'm going to start looking at that a little differently. And that's where I'm going to ask, well, is it verified? Does this source provide me materials that can really verify what they're saying? Like, show me the gills on the turtle. Show me that they, this is a very outlandish example, but are there photos? Are there recordings? Are there studies? Like, why should I believe you? Especially if you're the only one saying it, you better prove to me why I should believe you and have a lot of data to back it up. And show me where I can find the raw information. Authoritative. Does the source have training or experience to back up what they're saying? If you're an archaeologist telling me that a turtle is a shark, I'm not listening to you. If you're a marine biologist with a PhD and 20 years of experience studying sharks and amphibians, well, I'm going to listen to you probably a little bit more. Informed. Is the source well informed about the specific news, the topic they're covering? Are they an eyewitness? So in breaking news, you want eyewitnesses. You want people who are close to them. Maybe they're not experts, but they were there. And that's a different weight you're going to put on it to somebody who maybe, I read this story recently. Gwen Florio, local journalist and author, wrote a story called Silent Heart. And in it she has this character who is this doctor on Afghanistan and culture, and as soon as the terrorist attack happened, everyone's asking him to interpret it. He had never been there. He'd studied it his whole life, but he'd never been there. So he could weigh in on, like, well, this is what the culture's like, but he took it as like, oh, well, people need me and I'm important, and he started making all of these he's a really awful character. He's awful. But it's really, like, indicative of what a lot of people do. And so that's where you ask yourself, well, maybe they have some expertise, but why are they related to this story? And one other thing to think about that is the right expert, right? So so many times lawyers weigh in on stories when they're not a scientist, they're not a doctor, they are a lawyer. They might be privy to information we don't have, but let's say we're talking about, okay, let's use an example of cinnamon roll prices are going up. And I am talking to the baker, I'm talking to the farmer, I'm going to talk to some consumers, I'm going to talk to cafeterias, and those are people who are part of the story, they're informed. I'm not going to be talking to soda manufacturers. I'm not going to be talking to sugar manufacturers unless it's like a tangential relation. So it's making sure that it's the right expert for the story, even if they really are a credentialed expert. And then finally, we've already talked about named. Are they named? And is it a good reason? So this is one tool when we don't have time to go through all of these layers ourselves. There are people out there doing this for us. And you all kind of nodded with Snopes. I just pulled one example from some recent news about the caravan at the border, and there's been a lot of fear about, is this people going to invade, is it women and children? And we're not at the border, we're in Montana, we're on the other border. And so we do rely a lot of people who are close by. And this particular image has been making the rounds on the internet. And it says, we are human beings, open the border. And then it says, see any women or children here. And this is feeding into that larger story of like, no, it's not women and children. It's like this caravan of really dangerous people. And so what Snopes does is that they take really popular things, and they, especially things that are blowing up on social media or getting picked up by the news really rapidly without the fact checking, like we saw with that Nice example, and they say, all right, hold up, like how true is this? And they'll give you levels. They'll be like, all the way true, mostly true, false. And so one thing that they found was this is actually from 2016, I think, and it's from what is it from? A camp in Greece, a refugee camp in Greece from 2016. And so it's totally different context, photo taken out of context that was picked up and released for this ideology, support, this fear. And the thing I love about Snopes is that I can give you all the tools in the world, but it comes back to the time. And I want you to have these initial flags when you're listening to the news about, you know, is this the right source? Is this news? Is it verified? Is there a reason they should be anonymous? Like, these are all the checklists you're asking yourself, but there's backup. There's people who do this for a living. And sometimes it's a little harder because Snopes kind of does their own, like, picking and choosing. But, I mean, I like to go through, like the top stories because I probably have heard of some of them or seen some of them. And so, like, what's new? Okay, did Muslim militants kill 120 Christians? You know, so, like, we're seeing this come out, and we can go all the way down to it, and it will say it's a mixture. And they'll tell you why it's true, and they'll tell you why it's false. And that's another level that I so appreciate of journalism and having someone help me out. So those are kind of my big tools, the neighborhoods, the little check mark, especially with breaking news, and then just call in some backup. And a lot of newspapers will do this too. They'll fact check, you know, like whenever there's a big politician giving a speech, there's always like 3 newsletters out doing live fact checking. So let them help you and just know where to look. Sometimes it's hard to know, but they're always out there. So I'm going to stop there because of time. But I'll just say, like, there's a lot of people who decide if news is trustworthy, and we're a huge part of it, but also don't feel overwhelmed. Find journalists and editors and publishers you trust. And ironically, like being in the advertising industry, it's opened up my eyes a lot more to ads and brands. If you want brand integrity, you're not going to advertise on sites that are fake news. I'm not saying if you see a Nike ad to believe the news, but it's just another level of support for researched and well-written stuff. Like when we advertise, we have blacklists of sites that we just know are not trustworthy. And that's just a whole other layer I never thought about. So let people help you. These are, I know it was a lot of information and checklist stuff, and I think a lot of it is common sense. But when you see it, I think it helps to just bring the focus from when you're listening at news. So I know I was going to talk a little bit about being a journalist and some of the challenges, but I kind of peppered it through, and I don't want to keep you. But it's dangerous to be a journalist, and I would ask for some empathy for journalists. It's hard to make a living. It's one of the reasons I work in advertising right now. To be very frank and honest, it's really hard to make a living as a journalist. There's not a lot of support for in-depth investigative pieces like there could have been in prior situations, but there's a lot more opportunity for people to do their own work. It's just finding funding is hard. And there's a lot of places where it's really dangerous to be a journalist. Not only is it economically very hard, but it's also very dangerous. And so this is just kind of another colored map of where being a journalist is really dangerous work. And it's hard sometimes to get the information you need on the deadline, to make your editors happy, to produce the 11 stories you were asked to produce that week, and also do a good job. And so that's where there's a little bit of forgiveness and burden on the reader, but hopefully you can find outlets and journalists that you trust. So with that, do you guys have any questions? We can just go to. I kept you late.
What do you think of Matt Taibbi?
Matt Taibbi?
Yeah, he works for the Rolling Stone.
You know, I have really mixed feelings about, I'll just say many journalists. I won't even pick him out in general, but there are some journalists, even in our community, who make a really good living. And they make a living freelancing. They write for big deal articles like Outside and Sunset Magazine and National Geographic. Like in Missoula, they make a living doing that. And Sometimes I have issues with the ethics of what they do, and that's something that is through my own, and I'm not speaking, this is general, but I have my own qualms with how they cover things. And I think that opinion comes from some of them meeting in person, but some of them are interviews, and like a lot of times when big deal journalists are big deals, they're interviewed about being a journalist. And I think I can tell a lot from how they talk about their craft that way. And sometimes I really love what they do, and they're cocky for a reason, because they're really good. And they are doing good work, and they found a way to make it happen, and that's awesome. And like, I wish more people could do that. And other times they're cocky and let that get in the way of telling the story. So I have mixed feelings, yeah.
So you don't, okay. I just have a few journals that I do like to know. If I know that they're going to, so I know that the article was written by them.
Which I think is huge. I think you have to. Absolutely. And I mean, especially here locally, it's a whole different layer of like, I went to school with Nikki Willett, and she reports on Montana Public Radio, and like, I know Nikki is doing a good job. Like, because I've worked with her and I know her, and we were students together. And I trust Nikki to tell me what's going on in Flathead. And so I don't have to do it myself. She just got the news director job. Yeah, I think you have to find journalists and papers you trust, or else you're going to be exhausted. Yeah, absolutely. So my like layer of caution was not specifically speaking to anybody, but yeah, I think that's great, actually. As long as you continue to challenge yourself to make sure that they're continuing to be accurate. And still questioning, asking those questions about sources, asking about if it's the right sources, were they close enough to the incident? Because sometimes I think there can be some overconfidence sometimes.
Sometimes their subject needs research, and it takes time to understand what they're writing about.
Yeah, and a lot of times the time isn't given. A lot of times the time is not given. The funding runs out, the timeline runs out, and hopefully the best thing that I think you can look for is the transparency of the journalist telling you that. Of saying, I tried to reach this person, they didn't call me back. Telling you that they tried and they did not get that opinion. Or telling you, I wanted to go here and I couldn't, and this is a part that still needs to be discovered. I think the best journalists are, it's hard to do, it's hard to admit when you don't know the whole story, especially when you're supposed to be the expert or the translator and the communicator, but I think that's one of the best things a journalist can do, is tell you what parts they didn't tell you, or couldn't tell you. And that's hard. And sometimes editors take that out too, because they want to look like the most reputable source, and there's a whole layer of editing that the journalist doesn't have control over, and so you hopefully trust that editor too. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you came.
Thanks.
I learned a lot.
I hope it was
helpful.
helpful.
A lot of people.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Until you give my whole thing.